Today is March 31st, 2018. We are at the St. Francis Retreat Center in San Juan Bautista, California. Tonight, Bhante Vimalaramsi is going to read Madhupindika Sutta 18, the Honeyball Sutta.
The Honeyball Sutta is very interesting because there's been a book written about it that was a PhD doctrine book. Thesis, that's the word. And what happened was the man that wrote the thesis, he was just ready to give it to his teacher, and they were going to, and his teacher died. And there was two other people that were writing the same kind of thesis, not as well as what this is, but he had to go back and rewrite for another thesis so he could do his PhD. About 15 years after he became a teacher at a university, he went to visit a friend, Nyanaponika Thera. Nyanaponika was a German monk, very intelligent. And he showed him his thesis, and Nyanaponika was very much impressed with it and said, why don't we make it into a book? And Venerable Nyanananda said, that's fine. And that happens to be the first book that was printed at the Buddhist Publication Society. Now, Nyanaponika was really an amazing monk. On our website, if you want to listen to some of his talks, you can listen to them. Very, very nice. He had a Sri Lankan accent, so it takes a little while to get used to it. I've been in Asia so long, those kind of accents, I can go right through them, no problem. He does use a lot of Pali words, but he explains how some of these words are translated, and it's a better translation to use another word. For instance, Sankara is always translated as formations. He said it's better to use the word preparations. Now, the Sankara is the first thing after ignorance that arises. It's body, speech, and mind. It's a potential of these things arising. So to say that they're preparations is really more accurate than formations. And that's just a small example of some of the stuff that he does. So, unfortunately, I've met him a couple of times. And he was very sick. That was a few years ago, and he has just died. And he makes it real, brings it home to me that all of my teachers are dying. Dukkha dukkha. Anyway, the book that he wrote, you can, if you want a copy of it, just ask us. You can also get it online, but I like the actual book better than reading on a screen. That's just me. It's called Concept and Reality. There's another little story about that. when he wrote it, he wanted it to be given away free. And a lot of people got copies, and then before long they were selling it for $15 a copy. So I'm so impressed with this book that I had David write to him and ask if we could have 250 copies of his book. And we didn't hear anything from him, so I went to go see him. And one of the first things I asked him was, can I make 5,000 copies of this book? And he said no. Now, I could get the book online. I could have done it anyway. But he said no, so I went, okay. And then he said, and there's this place in America, Dhamma Sukha Meditation Center, and they want 250 copies. And I said, yeah, that's me. So I didn't do anything with it then. The next year I went back to see him, and he gave me permission. So I printed up 1,000 copies. I do 1,000 copies at a time. And they are for free. I guaranteed him that I'm not interested in any money about this. So, thus have I heard on one occasion the Blessed One was living in the Sakyan country of Kapvilavatu in Negrodas Park. Kapvilavatu is where the Bodhisattva grew up. So his family was there, and his father was there, the king of the area. Then when it was morning, the Blessed One, dressed, taking his bowl and outer robe, went into Kapvilavatu for alms. When he'd wandered for alms in Kapvilavatu and had returned from his alms round after his meal, he went to the great wood for the day's abiding. Entering the great wood, he sat down at the root of a bulva sapling for the day's abiding. Dandapani, now the way they had things set up, there was a lot of other minor kings, and they would meet like once a week or something like that and discuss the problems of the area. And Dandapani was very much a Brahmin, and he really didn't like what the Buddha was teaching. So, Dandapani the Sakyan, while walking and wandering for exercise, went to the great wood, and when he entered the great wood, he went to the bulva sapling where the Blessed One was, and exchanged greetings to him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood at one side, leaning on his stick. Now, he was a king, and he wasn't going to put his head lower than the Buddha, but it was also highly disrespectful to stand there. What does the recluse assert? What does he proclaim? Friend, I assert and proclaim my teaching in such a way that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world, with its gods, its Maras and Brahmins, or Brahmas. In this generation, with its recluses and Brahmins, its princes and its people, in such a way that perceptions no more underlie that Brahman who abides detached from sensual pleasures, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving for any kind of being. When this was said, Dandapani the Sakyan shook his head, wagged his tongue, I love that. And raised his eyebrows until his forehead puckered with 3 lines. Then he departed leaning on his stick. Then when it was evening, the Blessed One rose from his meditation, went to Nigroda's park, where he sat down on a seat made ready, and told the monks what had taken place. Then a certain monk asked the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, how does the Blessed One assert and proclaim his teaching in such a way that he does not quarrel with anyone in the world, with its gods, its maras, and its brahmas? In this generation, with its recluses and brahmins, its princes and its people. And, Venerable Sir, how is that perceptions no more underlie the Blessed One, that Brahman who abides detached from sensual pleasures, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving for any kind of being? Monk, as to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust, the end of the underlying tendency to aversion, the end of the underlying tendency to craving, the end of the underlying tendency to views, the end of the underlying tendency to doubt, of the underlying tendency to conceit, of the underlying tendency to desire for being, of the underlying tendency to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. Here these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. That is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the Sublime One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling. Now the monks made a mistake here, because they listened to this short thing about what he was talking about, but they didn't ask him any questions. Always after the Buddha would give a discourse, he would stop for a while. And if you didn't have any questions, he'd get up and walk away. So these monks heard this, and they were kind of shy. And they didn't ask him any questions. But they also didn't understand what he was talking about. Then soon after the Blessed One had gone, the monks considered, "Now, friend, the Blessed One has risen from his seat, gone into his dwelling after giving only a summary in brief, without expounding the detailed meaning. Now, who will expound this in detail?" Then they considered, the Venerable Mahakachana is praised by the teacher and esteemed by his wise companions in the holy life. Mahakachana, anytime you ask him a question, he would always give you an answer how it pertained to dependent origination. He is capable of expounding the detailed meaning. Suppose we went to him and asked him the meaning of this. Then the monks went to the Venerable Mahakachana and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, they sat down at one side and told him what had taken place, adding, "Let the Venerable Mahakachana expound it to us." Now they're going to get cuffed up a little bit. The Venerable Mahakachana replied, "Friend, it is though a man needing heartwood, seeking heartwood, wandering in search of heartwood, thought that heartwood should be sought for among the leaves and branches of a great tree standing possessed of heartwood. After he had passed over the root and the trunk. So it is with you, venerable sirs, that you think I should be asked about the meaning of this after you passed the Blessed One by, when you were face to face with the Blessed One. For knowing, the Blessed One knows. Seeing, he sees. He is vision, he is knowledge, he is the Dhamma. He is the Holy One, he is the sayer, the proclaimer, the elucidator of meaning, the giver of the deathless, the Lord of the Dhamma, the Tathagata. That was the time that you should have asked the Blessed One the meaning. As he told you, you should have remembered it. Excuse me. Surely, friend Kachana, knowing the Blessed One knows, seeing he sees, he is vision. He is knowledge, he is the Dhamma, he is the Holy One, he is the sayer, the proclaimer, the elucidator of meaning, the giver of the deathless, the Lord of the Dhamma, the Tathagata. That was the time that we should have asked the Blessed One the meaning. As he told us, we should have remembered it. Yet the Venerable Mahakachana is praised by the teacher and esteemed by his wise companions in the holy life. The Venerable Mahakachana is capable of expounding the detailed meaning of this summary given in brief by the Blessed One without expounding the detailed meaning. Let the Venerable Mahakachana expound it without finding it troublesome. Then listen, friends, and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, friend. Now, there's something that's happened since the time of the Buddha that has changed. During the time of the Buddha, all the monks, it didn't matter what the seniority was, they all called themselves friend. In the Parinibbana Sutta, the Buddha changed that, and he said the senior monk should be called Bhante, and the junior monk, which means friends, is Awuso. And that's the way it was for a while, but these days, all monks call themselves Bhante. And when we talk to another monk, we don't have to remember their name, we just say Bhante. So, yes, friend, the monks replied. The Venerable Mahakachana said this, friends, when the Blessed One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling after giving a summary in brief without expounding the detailed meaning, that is, monk, as to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, and hold to it, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust. the end of the underlying tendency to aversion, the end of the underlying tendency to craving, the end of the underlying tendency to views, and that is clinging, the end of the underlying tendency to doubt, the end of the underlying tendency to conceit, of the underlying tendency to desire for being, of the underlying tendency to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. Here these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. I understand the detailed meaning of this to be as follows. Now, there is a lot of repeating in this. Don't let your mind wander. Let it sink in. Dependent on the I and forms I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is I contact. With eye contact as condition, there is I feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. Mental proliferation here is your opinions and beliefs, and also your mental attachments to unwholesome states quite often. Anger, sadness, fear, anxiety, any kind of frustration, whatever it happens to be. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present forms cognizable through the eye. Dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is ear contact. With ear contact as condition, there is ear feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. The mental proliferation is also a place where if there's any upset in the mind, you start repeating the same things over and over and over again. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present sounds cognizable through the ear. Dependent on the nose and odors, nose consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is nose contact. With nose contact as condition, there is nose feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present. Smells cognizable through the nose. Dependent on the tongue and flavors, tongue consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is tongue contact. With tongue contact as condition, there is tongue feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. And this is also where you get caught up in your thinking and analyzing and all of those kind of distractive kind of thoughts. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present. Taste cognizable through the tongue. Dependent on the body and tangibles, body consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is body contact. With body contact as condition, there is body feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present, tangibles cognizable through the body. Dependent on mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is mind contact. With mind contact as condition, there is mind feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one craves. What one craves, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man with respect to the past, future, and present, mind objects cognizable through mind. When there is the I, a form, and I consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of eye contact. When there's the manifestation of eye contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of eye feeling. When there's the manifestation of eye feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there's the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. When there is the ear, a sound, and ear consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of ear contact. When there's the manifestation of ear contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of ear feeling. When there's the manifestation of ear feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there's the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there is the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. When there is a nose, an odor, and nose consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of nose contact. When there's the manifestation of nose contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of nose feeling. When there is the manifestation of nose feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there's the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. When there is a tongue, a flavor, and tongue consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of tongue contact. When there is the manifestation of tongue contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of tongue feeling. When there is the manifestation of tongue feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there is the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. When there is the body, a tangible and body consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of body contact. When there is the manifestation of body contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of body feeling. When there's the manifestation of body feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there's the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. When there is mind, mind object, and mind consciousness, it is possible to point out the manifestation of mind contact. When there is the manifestation of mind contact, it is possible to point out the manifestation of mind feeling. When there is the manifestation of mind feeling, it is possible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there is the manifestation of perception, it is possible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there is the manifestation of craving, it is possible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there is the manifestation of thinking, it is possible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. This is the arising of this whole mass of suffering. Okay? Now you have the I in good working form and color and form. When these two hit, this is called eye contact. With eye contact as condition, that means these three things have to happen in order for the next link to arise. So when eye contact arises, eye feeling arises, and this eye feeling is pleasant, painful, neither painful nor pleasant. With that eye feeling arising, there is perception. Perception is a thing that tells you whether it's pleasant or painful or neither painful nor pleasant. With that as condition, eye craving arises. Craving is the I like it, I don't like it mind. Okay, that's the definition of craving. With I craving as condition, thinking arises. Thinking is clinging. It's all of your thoughts, all of your opinions, all of your ideas. And this is where you really grab on to the idea that this is me, this is mine. Craving is just the beginning of that. But clinging is where we really take it personally. So when we have this thinking and story about, then you have the mental proliferation arising, where your stronger opinions, and you start analyzing and trying to figure out how all of this stuff works. And you can really get caught up in emotional attachments at this point. And this is when you start arguing with somebody else. It doesn't work that way. It works another way. But this is the links of dependent origination and how they actually do occur. So, when I hits color and form, I consciousness arises, these three, when they meet together, is called eye contact. If you see eye contact as it arises and you 6R right then, guess what? Eye feeling won't arise, perception won't arise, craving won't arise, because craving won't arise, clinging won't arise, because clinging won't arise, this mental proliferation won't arise. This is the importance of the 6Rs. Now again, you can't use the 6Rs as a stick to beat away some troublesome things that arise in your mind, some hindrances, some attachments that arise in the mind. The 6 R's are just so you let go of the attachment of taking it personally. And you'll notice every time you use the 6 R's, as soon as you relax, your mind becomes very clear for a moment. Your mind becomes very alert. Your mind becomes pure just at that time. It'd be nice if it kept on and kept it that way, but our minds don't work like that. So, when you have that pure mind, you bring that to something wholesome. Smile. And when you smile, your mind becomes lighter and more alert. And you bring that smile back to your object of meditation. So, this is a process that is impersonal. As soon as you let go of the very beginning of that I identification, that me, this is mine, as soon as you let that go, your mind becomes pure. And as you stay with your object of meditation and not take it personally, that means not grab onto it and make, this is me, this is mine, this is who I am. Okay, that's an attachment, isn't it? This is when you start letting go more and more of your opinions and your ideas of how this really is mine. You start letting go of that, and your mind becomes much more clear, and it will start to stay on your object of meditation for longer and longer period of time. So this is really an important process for you to be able to see for yourself. Now, this is not all of the links of dependent origination. There's stuff that happens before that, and tomorrow night you get to hear all of it. Okay? But this is the important part. Contact, feeling, perception, craving, clinging, habitual tendency, mental proliferation, the birth of action, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. That's how all of these things arise. But when you catch it at contact, all of these other links will not arise because you've purified mind at that time. So it's a real important thing for you to start realizing that this is a process. It is not a personal attachment to it. As you let go of the things that your mind clings to, as you let go of repeat thoughts, as you let go of the dissatisfactions and frustrations and fears and anxieties, as you 6R those and let them be, by not keeping your attention on them, they will get weaker and weaker until finally they will just disappear by themselves. They won't come up anymore. So it's real important to know that this is the way it works. And you'll see it so many times that you will become convinced of it. because that's the way it works. The idea of noting something until it goes away, or the idea of just releasing something and coming back to your object of meditation, this is why it doesn't work very well. It doesn't purify mind. The only thing that purifies mind is to be able to recognize that craving and let go of the craving. Relax. Now your mind is pure. Your mind is bright. Your mind is very alert. And you start seeing more and more subtle things arise. So it's a real important thing to realize how all of these things do manifest. They manifest because of a very subtle, little tiny, I like that. This is me. It's a quiet one. See, the thing with dependent origination, you have the right after feeling, there is craving, and that's capital C craving. But in each link of dependent origination, you have the Four Noble Truths, which means you still have some craving. That's why they start arising, because there is subtle craving there. And when you let go of consciousness, which I'll explain more tomorrow, there's no more conditions that will arise. And if there's no more conditions, then you are experiencing Nibbana. Okay? Now, this is real important stuff. And you'll get to understand it more, and it will start to come up while you're sitting. You'll start to see, oh, that happened, and the whole reason that this happens is because it's a conditional existence that we live. Everything is part of a concept. What's the definition of Nibbana? No more concepts. No more arisings. It's an unconditioned state. If there's no conditions, how can there be something arise? So as you keep using the 6 R's and you start going deeper into more subtle states and you start seeing little movements of mind's attention and you relax right then, you're letting go of one of the links of dependent origination. And as you do that, you're purifying your mind more and more. So it's a real important thing, and this is just the beginning of dependent origination. Like I said, tomorrow you'll get more, day after tomorrow you'll get more. So that you start seeing it and understanding it while you're doing your sitting, and you start to see these things come up. And as soon as you see them come up, then you relax and let them be. Every time you use the 6 R's, you are experiencing mundane Nibbana. Okay? A worldly kind of Nibbana. And after you use the mundane Nibbana a few 100,000 or 1,000,000 times, then you'll get to the supramundane, where you've let go of it for a moment and you get into an unconditioned state. Now, this next part is going to be talking about when there's no I, no form, no I consciousness. What we're talking about now is getting into this deeper state of meditation called neither perception nor non-perception. So I'll go through this real quick. When there's no I, no form, no I consciousness, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of contact. Makes sense, right? If you don't have an I, you don't have any color and form, I consciousness isn't going to arise. And if I consciousness doesn't arise, there's no eye contact that will arise. Makes sense. When there's no manifestation of eye contact, it is impossible to point out the manifestation of eye feeling. When there's no manifestation of eye feeling, it is impossible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's no manifestation of perception, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of craving. If there's no manifestation of craving, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's no manifestation of thinking, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. So, when there's no ear, no sound, no ear consciousness, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of ear contact. When there's no manifestation of ear contact, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of ear feeling. When there's no manifestation of ear feeling, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of perception. When there's no manifestation of perception, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of craving. When there's no manifestation of craving, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of clinging or of thinking. When there's no manifestation of thinking, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. So your mind is exceptionally clear when there is just that exquisite silence. There's no disturbance in your mind at all. And that's not quite nibbana, but that's close. And what relief there is when you get into this state where mind isn't running around and trying to come up with reasons for this, I need to think about this, I need to do that. It doesn't happen anymore, and your mind is just, And your mind will start to try to throw things to distract you. The thing with mind is it's really, really tricky. And everybody's mind knows where those buttons are to push to make a distraction arise. So you have to have sharp mindfulness. So when you see a slight movement of any mind's attention, relax. Let it be. Stay with that peaceful, calm mind. So some of you, when you come in for interviews, I tell you, you need to sharpen your mindfulness. Now, when I say that, what I'm actually saying is, I want you to pay a little bit closer attention to minds when it's very quiet, so you can see the slight movement and relax right then. not waiting for something to come all the way up, but see it and relax right then. So, how do you get rid of mental proliferation? Using the 6 R's. Don't get caught in your opinions and ideas and philosophies and ways you think it maybe should work, or into a philosophy of thinking, well, before the quiet mind, what was before that? How did the quiet mind come into being? The conditions were right for it to happen. That's all you have to say. It is part of a karmic occurrence. So, when there's no nose, there's no odor, there's no nose consciousness, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of nose contact. When there's no manifestation of nose contact, it is impossible to point out the manifestation of nose feeling. When there's no manifestation of nose feeling, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of perception. Why? Because feeling and perception are conjoined. If there's no feeling, there's no perception that will give it a name. When there's no manifestation of perception, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of craving. If there's no manifestation of craving, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of thinking. When there's no manifestation of thinking, it's impossible to point out the manifestation of besetment by perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation. Friends, when the Blessed One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling after giving a summary and brief, without expounding the detailed meaning, that is, monks, as to the source through which perceptions and notions, born of mental proliferation, beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, to welcome and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust. This is the end of the underlying tendency to aversion. This is the end of the underlying tendency to craving. This is the end of the underlying tendency to views, of the underlying tendency to doubt, of the underlying tendency to conceit, of the underlying tendency to desire for being, of the underlying tendency to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. Here these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. I understand the detailed meaning of this summary to be thus. Now, friends, if you wish, go to the Blessed One and ask him about the meaning of this. As the Blessed One explains it to you, you should remember it. Then the monks, having delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Mahakachana's words, rose from their seat and went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to him, They sat down at one side and told the Blessed One all that had taken place after he left, adding, "Then, Venerable Sir, we went to the Venerable Mahakachana and asked him about the meaning. The Venerable Mahakachana expounded the meaning to us with these terms, statements, and phrases. Mahakachana is wise, monks. Mahakachana has great wisdom. If you were to ask me the meaning of this, I would have explained it to you in the same way that Mahakachana has explained it." When this was said, Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, just as if a man exhausted and hungry, exhausted by hunger and weakness, came upon a honey ball. Wherever he would taste it, he would find a delectable flavor. So too, Venerable Sir, any able-bodied monk, wherever he might scrutinize with wisdom the meaning of this discourse on the Dhamma, would find satisfaction and confidence. Venerable Sir, what's the name of this discourse on the Dhamma? As to that, Ananda, you may remember this discourse on the Dhamma as the Honeyball Discourse." That's what the Blessed One said, and Venerable Ananda was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. Now, there's always some questions about that. A lot of people have come to me and say, how do I choose a teacher? What's the best way to choose a teacher? And there is an answer to this that the Buddha gave. And it's not very long, and I will read it to you. Okay. At Savatthi, the Buddha said this: "Monks, one who does not know and see as it actually is, aging and death, its origin, cessation, and way leading to its cessation, should search for a teacher in order to know this as it really is." Now, from the very beginning of this retreat, I haven't told you, but I've been showing you how dependent origination works over and over again. The only teachers that truly understand the Buddha's teaching will use the links of dependent origination as the backbone of the teaching. This is it. This is how this actually works. And in each link, there is the Four Noble Truths. There are the three characteristics of existence: impermanent, suffering, and the impersonal nature of all things. So if you start looking for a teacher and you truly want to know what the Buddha is talking about, they should actually start out telling you about the links of dependent origination. You might have to be with them for a little while before you start seeing, yeah, now I understand what he's talking about. I went to a teacher in Thailand, very famous. His name was Buddhadasa. Now, Buddhadasa, when he became a monk, he was very interested in meditation, and he was not interested in the way the monks were practicing and getting involved with what he called Thai magic. They didn't know what the Buddha's teaching was, and he saw that. So he studied 5 years. He studied all of the suttas. And when he began teaching, he was telling them about the Four Noble Truths. And when he taught the Four Noble Truths, he didn't teach it in the same order as anybody else knew them. He said, there is suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's a way to get out of the suffering, and there's the cessation of suffering. So the last two Noble Truths he changed around. And when I went and listened to him, I was walking with some Western monks after he gave the talk on that, and I started saying, he can't fool me. I know the Four Noble Truths when I hear them. And the other monk stopped and he said, that was the Four Noble Truths? Yeah. Wow. I didn't even recognize it as the Four Noble Truths. And he did that sort of thing with dependent origination. And he got a lot of people so that they really understood the words of the different links and that sort of thing in Pali, which I prefer not to teach in Pali for most things, because it takes the explanation of what each thing that I would say in Pali, it takes an explanation, and it's not the way I like to teach. I like to give a lot of definitions, like what mindfulness is, remembering to observe how mind's attention moves from one thing to another. What is meditation? Meditation is observing how things move from one thing to another as part of the links of dependent origination. That's what meditation is. It's real comical if you go to some people that have been meditating for a while and, what is meditation? Oh, it's becoming one with all. And all of these different weird things that they're coming up with. So it's real important that you understand how this process works by your observation of it. And you will become more and more familiar as we go through this. So, do you have any questions?
Would you repeat that definition just now of meditation?
Didn't you hear it?
I wanted to get the second half of it. Well, the first half.
I'm only teasing.
Right.
Okay, it's observing how mind's attention moves through the process of dependent origination. I just changed the words a bit, but that's the same thing. See, everything that we see, everything that we hear, everything that we feel is part of a process. And all processes are impersonal. There's nothing in this world that is personal. But how many people have the wrong idea? This is me, this is mine. And get confused. That's one of the reasons that a lot of people look outside of themselves and say, well, there must be something that's permanent. So, okay, we're going to have a God that's permanent. He's always going to be there. And that's just not how it works. But you have to have a very quiet mind to be able to see that. And most people are not willing to do it. And they think that the precepts are just it's only morality. We've had morality pushed down our necks or down our throats for years at church. Well, the precepts are not commandments. Take them or break them as you want. It's your choice, but look at the result of doing that. How difficult does your life become when you break precepts? And it says very plainly in Majjhima Nikaya, in Sutta 47, I think, the advantages of keeping the precepts without breaking them, and what benefits you have when you take it upon yourself to be responsible for your own words and actions. And not say, oh, it was only a little thing. Well, yeah, it might be a little thing, but it's going to come back and it's going to cause you problems through having hindrances arise when you're trying to purify your mind. And it says very plainly in the suttas, the closer you keep your precepts without breaking them, the more peaceful and calm your mind becomes. I have a lot of people that come to me that they keep the precepts very closely, and their progress in the meditation is remarkable. So, it's your choice whether you keep the precepts or not, but don't come complaining to me when life is hard.
Are the precepts that we read every morning?
Yes.
That's it?
No.
Okay, there's more.
The first 5. You don't even have to do all of them. Yeah.
Speaking of the precepts, the gossip, the right speech.
Uh-huh.
I went to a retreat in Wyoming and I asked, Joseph Goldstein was leading it, and I asked him, I had read that he took an oath for a few months where he wouldn't talk about someone if they weren't in the room.
That's not gossip. Gossip is making up stories about somebody else. Visualize that person standing right beside you and start talking about them. And all of a sudden you start talking in nice ways about them, not making up stories about what somebody else heard.
Well, he continued and he said that when he lowered talking about other people, his practice exponentially
Yeah, that's
increased.
true.
And I look at that, and coming from a working environment, it's all gossip. I mean, I mean, I would be meditating all day if I couldn't gossip. But it's a difficult precept. I mean, I could see where it would do remarkable things, but when I look at it, it's just, that's all everyone does. It seems like it's just gossip.
So you don't have to do it,
I
and you don't have to listen to it.
Right.
So all you have to do is say, "I'll see you later. I have to do something else." But a lot of things are made up,
Right.
and that's what gossip really is all about. It's about trying to deceive other people. And that's really what gossip is. Anytime you deceive someone else with what you say, you have a little voice that comes up inside of you if you pay attention, and it'll say, "I shouldn't have said that." Very quiet.
Right.
And it's so quiet that it's easy just to go, "Ah," and carry on. And then you come and you want to do a retreat, and you have huge amounts of hindrances arising. And you start going, "Oh, this meditation is really hard." And after, say, in a 10-day retreat, after 7 days, then your mind starts settling down because you've been letting go of the hindrances and purifying your mind. So now you have 2 or 3 days of good meditation, and it's time to go home. And I have had students that they weren't about to change their speech. You know, I'll change it on retreat. When I go home, I'm going to curse like a sailor. I'm going to drop the F-bomb continually. Well, okay, come back for a retreat, and you have 7 days of actually wasted time because all the hindrances are there, and you're not learning that you are causing yourself that suffering. Any kind of foul language it's language that's pleasant to the ear of other people and to your own ear. It's very pleasant. If you keep that precept, your sitting is going to be much easier. I had a guy in Malaysia that said, yeah, I'll keep the precepts. How long do I have to do that? And I said, well, let's start at 100 years and go beyond that. It's all the time. It's in private and in public. Keeping your speech. Most people that do cursing, they have a lot of anger, and they start using that cursing in their speech. So why don't we learn how to forgive ourselves for doing that and lose that kind of speech just to see what happens in the next year, if you can do it for a year? And not saying things that are going to deceive other people. Don't say things that you know is not true. Watch what happens. Do it for a year. That's not that long. Your mindfulness gets better. Your mind becomes more uplifted. And you become more efficient with what you do while you're doing it. And it's your choice.
Bhante, was there more in the Samyutta Nikaya about finding a teacher, or was that
That was it. That's the main teaching. You have to understand, this is it. Anytime you hear about the Four Noble Truths, it's actually talking about the links of dependent origination, which I will get to tomorrow. You'll get them all, and I'll read some other suttas to you so you understand. This is the backbone. Everything else is just on the fringes. This is it. And that's why Mahakachana, he was foremost in, he was second to Sariputta in his understanding of dependent origination and how it worked. And he became one of the 80 great arahats. And he was very brilliant in the way that he describes it in other suttas. He's really good. Now, I have run across some monks that are studying the Agamas, which is the Chinese version of the suttas. And they say, in the Agamas, it's only the Buddha's teaching. It's only the Buddha's words. Now, I just got through reading a sutta that it had the Buddha's words in it, but it was explained by somebody else. And he would reject that. Finally, I had to stop talking to this monk because he wasn't making sense. He was attached to the Agamas. The Buddha has to have said it, or else it's not true. Well, Sariputta was second to the Buddha. He had some pretty good ideas. And he had some great understanding. I mean, the Buddha said, Sariputta keeps the wheel of Dhamma rolling. So he was pretty well praised. So I can trust some of the suttas that are given to Sariputta. Some of them are great, absolutely brilliant. So one of the things that I've noticed more and more when people call themselves Buddhist is they're getting really rigid. This is what the Buddha said. And if you compare what the Buddha said in the suttas with what they're saying, there's a distinct difference. But they're so rigid. And I'm not going to listen to anything else except what I think is right. And I'm seeing that more and more, and it kind of scares me. And some of my students that are starting to teach, I keep on encouraging them not to be so rigid. Listen to what other people say. Compare it to what the Buddha said. If it doesn't match, just use what the Buddha said.
What do you think the driver is for their rigidity?
I can tell you in one word: conceit. As I was explaining this morning to somebody, this is like being in college, and I'm an archaeologist, and I go out to some place and I find something that nobody has ever seen, and it doesn't agree with what people think the way archaeology is, like finding skulls and that sort of thing. Well, I go out and I find a skull that's this big. And I come in and I say, look at this. And they'll do everything but call me an honest person. Oh, you made that. That's not real. one of the observations that David was making a little while ago was all of the scholars agree that Abhidhamma is not straight from the Buddha's teaching. But all the monks, they will tell you that, yeah, this is the Buddha's teaching. Well, it didn't come around till 250 years after the Buddha died. That says something. It wasn't in the first Buddhist council when there were all of these arahats around. And it wasn't in the second Buddhist council. It didn't come around until the third Buddhist council. So I'm not real enthusiastic about people that are practicing Abhidhamma, because what they teach is what it says in the book of Abhidhamma, but it doesn't match the actual practice in the suttas.
And the other interesting thing is, if you think of the Buddha's environment, there was a sort of checkup on everything in real time, frequently.
Oh, yeah.
And so because it was a very vibrant community, constantly exchanging views and stuff, it meant that it could be, people could be shown to be talking nonsense or not, as the case may be.
Yeah.
So that there was a process of sort of clarification rather than stuff just being accepted because it's got historical longevity.
Yeah. The thing with the suttas is there was an oral tradition for the first 500 years. And then they put it down on paper. When you put it down on paper, you leave yourself open to have things changed. When you do the oral tradition, I'm going to memorize everything in this book. Then I'm going to go to the monks that have been tested before and passed their test. And I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to start reciting this whole book. And if I make a mistake, if I mispronounce something, those monks are going to stop me and correct me. Now, this is the most accurate way to keep information alive, is through oral tradition. But the monks started getting a little bit lazy and they wanted to write it down, so that was the fourth Buddhist council in Sri Lanka when that occurred. I went to the cave where the monks started doing that, by the way. It was quite interesting. But that's when there started to be more changes in the way people were recording the Buddha's teaching. And then as you go from one country to the next, you have to translate. And the translation is hard because not all people use the same ideas in the same way, and they describe them differently. So things started changing. And as they went north and into China, and then went over to Korea, went over to Japan, what they call the suttas is really very far from the Buddha's teaching. I read a thing in the San Diego newspaper about this reporter. He was going to go and report what he learned when he went to a Zen retreat. And he said every morning we would get up at 5 o'clock and we would recite the Japanese version of the Korean version, of the Chinese version, of the Sanskrit version, of the original Pali. And that just explained the whole thing right there. It's just, this doesn't work this way. That's why there has to be the practice first before you go into the suttas. I can find mistakes here that don't agree with the practice that I've done. And occasionally I'll go to Bhikkhu Bodhi and said, this doesn't make sense the way you're saying it. It'd be good to change. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. That's okay. I did my part. I told him where I saw a mistake. If he doesn't want to change that, that's okay. But not be so rigid that I insist on it, and if he doesn't change it, then I'm going to condemn the book. No, this book is too valuable. There's so much information just in this one book. You have all the information you need to attain Nibbana.
Just need the willpower and the time, I guess.
Well, and somebody to help you along.
And the gentleman who you were talking about, who was the scholar, the Norwegian was he, or he was a... So what he did was just a translation of that particular
Yeah,
discourse.
yeah.
Yeah. And this is going to sound like a stupid question, it probably is. Why is that valued so highly? Did he do a construction of it which came together better than anybody else?
You're talking about Buddhaghosa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it clear?
Well, see, the thing that has happened in Buddhism is it becomes real popular for a while, and the monks are really good, and they study a lot, and they meditate, and then they start dropping off after a few hundred years. And when he wrote the Visuddhimagga, he went there for the express purpose of taking the commentaries that were in Sri Lanka and changing them into a good readable Pali. And a lot of the things weren't his words. He was taking them from the commentaries, and there was 125 commentaries that he used. But at the time, there were 4 different Buddhist traditions, and he was trying to bring them all together. So he used some of the ideas from this tradition and some of the ideas from this tradition. And when he didn't know, he went back to the Vedas that he had already memorized, and he started using some of the information from the Vedas. He was not a true Buddhist scholar. He was a Pali translator. And he didn't understand meditation. Now, the first part of the Visuddhimagga is actually pretty good because it's talking about morality, and it gives you some nice stuff that is decent. The middle of the book is about meditation. He didn't know anything about meditation, but he knew what the Vedas said. So he put it in Buddhist words. At the time, the monks in Sri Lanka had been kind of lax. They didn't really know what the meditation was all about, or if there was people that knew, there weren't many. They weren't really big on their scholarship. So he comes along with a very well-written thing that's taking these 4 different traditions and putting them together, and the commentaries that was already in the Buddhist, or the in the Sangha, and translated and put them into Pali. When he did that, he wrote it in such a way that it was absolutely wonderful if you didn't know what the Buddha's teachings were. And they read it, and they went, yeah, this is it. because they didn't have the education at the time. But about 15, 20 years later, it excited monks so much that they started doing the meditation, they started doing scholarship, and they started going, wait a minute, this isn't right. But it had become so popular, they couldn't stop it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then what about the work of the gentleman where you got some copies, where you have copies of his scholarship?
He was in Sri Lanka.
Right. And what was the specific topic area the same as what we've been talking about today?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And that was a translation that he was.
No, that was his writing.
Oh, so that
He took this sutta as the guideline, and then he expounded his ideas, which really agree with a lot of the suttas and that sort of thing. I've had some students come and I give them the book and they say, wow, this is really dry. And the only reason he would say that it was dry is it doesn't have any stories in it to speak of. This is just straight Dhamma. When I got a hold of the book as a young monk, one of my Western friends came along and said, hey, you got to look at this one. And I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. It's just fascinating. It's very deep, and it makes you think very straight about what the Buddha was saying. And the concepts he called papancha. And that basically means just wayward ideas as compared to reality. I'll send you a copy. Or do you have a copy to give?
I have a copy at my home. I can lend it to you. Yeah.
Well, we can send it too.
Yeah, okay.
We don't have many left?
No, we have many.
Oh, okay. Let us know.
Bhante, I don't know if it was clear that the Visuddhimagga was written 900 years after the death of the Buddha.
Right.
That's what Bhante was explaining. And this concept in reality was written
In the 40s.
In the 40s, so, yeah.
His whole talks on Nibbana are also on the internet, and it's a big volume of work.
Yes.
I printed it out. It's,
Yeah.
that's also great.
That's one of his books. He's got a lot of them. We have a series of his books. He gave 34 talks just on Nibbana.
I find it very supportive of everything that we do and learn here.
Yeah. Yeah, when I went to see him, I mean, I was a complete stranger to him when I sat down and started talking with him. I wound up talking for 5 hours. I was asking him questions, he was asking me questions to see whether I really understood it or not. That's great stuff.
But the only thing that threw me off was the preparations.
Well, that for formations, it really does make sense.
It does. It just took a while to kind of
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah. And if you want to listen to it, we have it on our website. So you can listen to him say these things, and it's pretty accurate with what's down in the book. I mean, it doesn't, it's not varied anything, so. You can read it while you listen to it if you want to do that.
He talks kind of fast.
He does. But he got really, really sick. I guess he was 80, I think it was 87 when he died, wasn't he? 87? Something like that. And he died in a lot of pain. His body just... He only had a quarter of one lung that was functional. And he was taking medicines constantly. They tried to keep him alive as long as they could. But it was... Getting to talk to him a couple times was... It's a highlight. Yeah.
Bhante, what do you recommend? How often it's good to take precepts?
I highly recommend that you take them every day. Not as a rite and ritual, but as a reminder to keep your precepts going. And if you do happen to break a precept, stop right then. Don't continue breaking it. Stop right then. Forgive yourself for making a mistake. Say the precepts again with the strong determination, I'm not going to do that again. And everybody makes a mistake once in a while, right? But as you do that, and you keep making a strong determination, I don't want to do that anymore, you'll stop doing it. You'll stop breaking a precept, whatever it happened to be.
I noticed about 5 years ago you recommended, instead of just saying, I take the precept to refrain from false speech, then you also said harsh speech and vulgar language.
Right.
So I started doing that. I just added it. And I didn't realize how much I actually used vulgar language for harsh speech.
Yeah.
So I started to take it every time that I was going to meditate. I would take the precepts and I would put in that phrase. So I started really catching myself. So you're right, you really see it. But what I really saw, like the following year, was that when I was alone and I would trip over something and there would be this, the F-bomb would come out. Mentally, I wouldn't say anything, but there's that habitual tendency. So I'd see that habitual tendency would come out. And it's almost all gone. All of that programming to use those words, it's almost completely gone. Once in a while, just the concept will come out, like the F-bomb or something like that. But it's very, very rare, and it only just starts. And so I can kind of laugh at that and say, it's still, there's a little seed still in there. But it's very interesting how plastic our intellect is and how influential it is to culture and early programming through my teenage years. As a teenager, it was really cool to use those words.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it turned out it's just a bunch of garbage programming.
Yeah. And the thing is, you can't get away from it in our culture anymore. It's on television, for crying out loud. You can't listen to the radio if there's a talk program because they're cursing. And they think it's cute. It's not. I was shocked when I came back from Asia. I mean, I had culture shock that lasted for almost 2 years just from the speech that was being used. And it was being used by just about everybody around. Oh no, that's not so good.
And do you think that's worse around, Dhamma Sukha, not because of Dhamma Sukha, but because of that area being particularly balanced, or what do you think?
I was all over the United States for 3 years.
Wow.
I did a lot of traveling. I got back here and I found out that they had a Greyhound bus that was comfortable. I was in buses that, these short Asians, you know, they only have that much room for your legs. And I was going in buses all over the place, overnight, and sometimes it would be travel for a long time. Oh, it was torture. And I got to a Greyhound, and I could stretch out, and I could lean back, and oh man, this was high luxury. But I'll tell you a secret. In Asia, they have sleeper buses. Double, and I slept in a double bed.
Wow.
When I went from one town to another.
What country?
And India. And now I'm thinking, why doesn't Greyhound do that? Are they?
Between LA and San Francisco.
Oh, what a nice way to go overnight. Get a good night's sleep.
The Amtrak has it too.
Well, that's a train. That's yeah. The sleepers and the trains have been around for a long time. Yeah.
If someone's in a position where they have to listen to really vulgar language and can't get away from it, I just was wondering if maybe loving kindness might help the situation out.
Well, try it and see.
Okay.
I can't give you a definite on that. That depends on the people around and
I'll try and I'll give you a report.
yeah.
You have two of the books, right? That's the middle name and the long discourses.
This is the connected discourses, Samyutta Nikaya.
How many such books do we have? The original?
Bless Bhikkhu Bodhi for this. This is supposed to be 5 books, and he put it all into one. Then there's the Anguttara Nikaya, which is supposed to be 12 books, and he put it into one. Yeah. He didn't consider that monks would want to carry these suttas with them. And well, I don't need this section because I'm going to be giving a retreat here, and this is the one I want. This section is the one I want. I can't do that anymore. When they first came out, this was 2 books. Now it's 1. And it weighs 5 pounds, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're carrying a suitcase, it's a lot. So the Digha Nikaya is a little bit smaller than this. The Anguttara Nikaya is a little bit bigger than this. And that's the 4 books. Now you can get e-books and get these on e-book, but they haven't done enough work on them so that you can go where you want to go when you want to get there. Otherwise you have to flip pages, and that's no good. Go ahead.
One of the things that I was thinking about is when we were talking about the commentaries in Buddha-Ghosa's works, is the confusion that was presented with jhana practice and what jhana is.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that now with some of the writers are talking about samadhi, and they're saying, well, there's sutta jhana and there's commentarial jhana, and trying to reconcile these 2 ideas. And it's just one of the many discrepancies in the commentaries with the experience of practice that Buddha-Ghosa didn't know about or wasn't able to relate to. And I know from my own practice, I've gotten to places where I experienced something, I've looked in the dictionary that is from the commentarial understanding or a commentarial description, and it wasn't at all what my reality, my experience was.
Right.
And I began to then to start to question, whether that writing was really had accuracy or validity.
Well, there's a couple things that he did. One thing, he would take a concept and then he would write down, there are 10 of these. There are 10 different kinds of faith. There are 10 different kinds of equanimity. And he started breaking it down so much that you don't realize that they're supposed to be weaving together. And they make it a great intellectual knowledge, but not a practical one.
Is Sukha Bodhi going to have more projects? I'm just curious. He's done so much. It's fascinating.
Well, he did the Sutta Nipata. That's not a book that I highly recommend the way he did it, because he used an awful lot of commentary and strange ideas. The Sutta Nipata, before he put it out, it's a book that's this size, was only that big. And then, well, you can still get it if you...
But what did he do with it?
He put commentaries, he put sub-commentaries. And it's not so good. Not to my way of thinking anyway. I started reading it, I got confused, and I actually do know what I'm reading most of the time, but I got really, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. Yeah.
If you could talk a little bit about the importance of maybe reading the suttas or other works, listening to Dharma talks compared with practice. I think before coming here, in my general understanding, that basically the basic instructions and the practice, and that's right there. But hearing you, it doesn't seem like that's how you view it.
Well, I have over 500 YouTubes of Dhamma talks where I read it, just what you're seeing I'm doing right now. That's what we have 500 YouTubes doing. So if you really want to get a better grasp of the different suttas, I would suggest going to that.
Sure. And my question is, to what extent that is for maybe like appreciating the beauty of the Dhamma, or like understanding at some level, versus like an actual practical aid to...
Well, I'm into practical.
It's completely practical.
Yeah.
Is it...
Every Dhamma talk I give, almost every Dhamma talk I give, is about the suttas and practice and how to incorporate those together.
So it's not that simply practicing, observing is all you need. It actually does help quite a lot to understand the...
I think so.
Because what you're saying essentially is that the good discourses on dependent origination actually give you insight into what the psychological processes are while you're meditating.
Right.
And therefore it has effects, relevancy to one's meditational style. So you can start looking for attitudes or things that happen, blah, blah, blah. So it does have an actual empirical sort of concrete effect on one's understanding of one's own psychological process as you meditate. You see what I mean? So it's actually got that value, even though it looks very exotic and in some ways at first bizarre. But then when you actually get to grips with it, it makes sense.
Well, I think that's what was really wonderful about the way you teach, is that you simplify these huge books of extremely scholarly Buddhism so that we can actually use it. We really,
Well, this is the way my mind has worked ever since I was a little kid. I would go in and I would look at something and I would sit there and I would think for a long time. And once I got something, I knew everything about it. And when I was in school, they considered me very slow. And I've been to a lot of different monks that have some psychic ability, can read your mind and that sort of thing. And they would tell me over and over again, your mind is really deep, but it sure isn't very fast. And that's, yeah. But sometimes I'll have to work on something for a year before I understand it, because it keeps coming back, and it's like, no, it's not quite like that. It's like seeing that the 5 aggregates and the 4 foundations of mindfulness are the same thing. I went through that for months, figuring it out and trying to think of every kind of instance, whether that was true or not. And I finally came to the conclusion, it is true. That is the way it works.
I'd just like to share a quick statement with the beginners. I found that if I listen to a YouTube or do some reading in Bhante's books or David's books, it's quite edifying to meditation, to have that bit of inspiration, clarity, edification, and get into meditation.
Yeah. Yeah. When David and I first started arguing about whether Vipassana was right or not, I started sending him at that time, very strangely, it was cassette tapes. And he started listening to them, and that's all that he did. He didn't watch television, he didn't listen to the radio, he just submerged into the Dhamma talks that I was reading, just like I'm doing now. And you can listen to those talks now, and they're consistent with what I'm teaching right now. Now that was 28 years ago. And I've given some talks over and over again to different places. And over the years, you're the only teacher I've ever run across that is consistent. Because I'm reading the same thing over and over again. How can I not be consistent? So it's kind of a interesting thing. And the resistance of other teachers to actually read the suttas to their students is remarkable. It's really something. They won't do it. They like to read 1 or 2 sentences and then go from the heart.
Conceptual proliferation.
Yeah. Okay, anything else? Let's share some merit then. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we've thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours, and all protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.